Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk to you about an article that's been published by 8 finance ministers from Europe, so 8 different countries, who all claim that Russia is lying about the state of its economy and that it's actually going through a Sovietization process. So basically converting the Russian economy back into where it was as part of the Soviet Union. So we'll have a look at the details of that explosive article and we'll hear about what they've had to say about Russia. And then we'll go on to talk about some of the evidence as to what is actually happening to the Russian economy right now, because this is probably one of the biggest topics of debate that I make videos about. Every time I talk about what's going on in the Russian economy, I'm hit with a wave of comments below from people saying, you're talking absolute nonsense. The Russian economy is actually doing really well. It's doing better than most of the economies from the West. It's forecast to grow really strongly in 2024 and 2025. And actually, the sanctions are more detrimental to the West than they are to Russia. So we'll go through some of the evidence as to why I don't think that's actually the case. So we'll have a look at things like the gasoline and sugar bans that Russia has announced recently. We'll talk about what's happening with inflation, because that's always a really good indicator as to what's happening on the ground in a country. We'll talk about the movement to being a wartime economy and the labour shortages and the pay rises that that's brought in. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summaries to what I think about this article that's been published by these 8 European finance ministers and what I think is actually going on right now in the Russian economy. But before we get into all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you're a watcher or a subscriber, thank you for watching my videos, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support, really helps to keep me motivated. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks recently, thank you so much for the time and effort and the generosity involved in that, really does mean a lot to me. And one of the other ways that you can support the channel is by buying a ticket in the prize draw for this sculpture, which is called Windswept Clock because it's got a fully working clock built into the sculpture itself. This is by the British artist Paul Margetts. Really nice piece. It's the only one I've got, so once I've given it away, I won't have this anymore. I think it would look really great in anybody's home. If you're interested in winning it, you need to have a look at the details below. You can buy a ticket for £1 each, which is around $1.30. So if you'd like to win this, have a look below and good luck. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, 8 European finance ministers have published an article claiming that Russia is lying about the state of its economy. Elisabeth Svantesson, Minister of Finance for Sweden, Stephanie Loos, Minister of Economic Affairs for Denmark, Mart Vorkliev, Minister of Finance for Estonia, Rika Pura, Minister of Finance for Finland, Arvils Aseridens, Minister of Finance for Latvia, Ginterē Skaist, Minister of Finance for Lithuania, Ilko Heinen, Minister of Finance for the Netherlands, and Andrzej Demański, Minister of Finance for Poland, have jointly written an article stating President Vladimir Putin and his authoritarian regime are peddling the false narrative that the Russian economy is strong and that its war machine is unharmed by Western sanctions. This is a lie that must be refuted. In fact, there are many signs that the Russian war economy is deteriorating. The sanctions and the other measures to weaken the Russian economy are effective, but even more can be done. We must continue to increase pressure against Putin's regime and support Ukraine. By re-Sovietizing the Russian economy, Putin has put it on a path towards its own decline. If Putin stays on this path, the long-term damage to the Russian economy will be significant. While Russian GDP may be growing, the economy is increasingly geared towards the war industry, upheld by large fiscal stimulus. This is not an endless source of growth, nor a sign of a stable economy. The Kremlin's war factories are already at maximum capacity. Unemployment has fallen to the point where there are reports that Vladimir Putin approved the replacement of imprisonment for forced labour. The tight labour market has put upward pressure on wages, while the weaker ruble increases import prices and is contributing to increasingly high inflation, despite Russian central bank efforts to fight it with high interest rates. To finance the war, the Russian government has tapped into the liquid assets of Russia's National Wealth Fund, and estimates by Bloomberg suggest it is almost halved in size since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as the country sacrifices its future prosperity to wreak havoc abroad. Moscow has also resorted to several extreme interventions to control the Russian economy. Export bans for petrol and sugar have been introduced to secure domestic supply, and strict capital controls have been put in place to prevent the exodus of private funds from the country and keep the ruble from free-falling. Even so, there are still reports of billions of US dollars being transferred out of the country. For many Russians, the wartime economic policy of the Kremlin must bring about a sense of déjà vu. Capital controls, export bans, and heavy investment in the war industry are not new policies, but rather a return to the Soviet playbook. What could be perceived and mistaken as a boost to Russian growth is in fact the beginning of Re-Sovietization of the economy. Many of the hallmarks are there: far-reaching market controls, heavy public spending financed by expropriation of private assets, and the reorientation of the economy towards the war industry, with a total disregard for the social and economic well-being of the population. History clearly shows that this is not a successful long-term strategy. The short-term overheating of the economy, fueled by heavy investments in the war industry and very limited access to technology, will likely hinder productivity gains and result in the stagnation of the private sector, even more rampant inflation, and increasing pressure on Russian households. To cover future deficits, Putin will have to use monetary financing, adding more fuel to inflation and further deplete the Russian cash reserves. If Putin stays on this path, the long-term damage to the Russian economy could be significant and is likely to further erode confidence. However, this also requires patience and resolve from the West. We must maintain and increase pressure while continuing and strengthening our support to Ukraine. Russian propaganda must not be left unchallenged. Unlike the story Russia would like to tell, sanctions targeting the Russian war machine are effective and necessary. They have reshaped the geography of Russia's foreign trade and limited its access to high-priority battlefield items. Between 2022 and 2023, Russian export revenues had decreased by around a third, based on information from the Russian Customs Service. Further measures are now being taken to up the pressure even more. In June, the EU adopted its 14th sanction package, including measures targeting liquefied natural gas and Russia's shadow fleet, which is carrying sanctioned Russian oil around the world. Meanwhile, at the G7 summit, leaders took further steps to deter China from aiding in the circumvention of sanctions and agreed to put in place a $50 billion loan to Ukraine, which will be serviced and repaid by expected future revenues from Russia's immobilized central bank assets. These are very welcome and important steps. Further steps are needed, however, to constrain Russia and support Ukraine. The West should ensure a swift and efficient operationalization of the G7 agreement on providing loans for Ukraine and explore options for far more reaching solutions. In accordance with international and EU laws, assets should remain frozen and sanctions should remain in place until Russia has paid for the damage it caused. Sanctions must be strengthened, particularly in strategically important sectors like energy, finance and technology, while the enforcement of existing sanctions must be improved. Both border and source countries should continue working on closing the loopholes that allow delivery of all goods that feed the Russian war machine, directly or indirectly. In particular, the Russian crude oil price cap must be better enforced, as we are still seeing trade above the cap at $60 per barrel. It is also essential to implement mirroring sanctions on Belarus and put more pressure on other major enablers of sanction circumvention in East Asia and the Middle East. The Ukrainians are fighting an existential battle for freedom and democracy against oppression and authoritarianism. Supporting Ukraine and undermining Russia's capacity to wage war at every turn should be a top priority of every democratic country. By re-Sovietizing the Russian economy, Putin has put it on a path towards its own decline. Now it is time for the West to up the pressure even more. So that article posted by the 8 finance ministers from Europe is really interesting and raises some really key points. So let's go on to discuss some of those in a bit more detail. The article referred to gasoline and sugar bans that have been announced by Russia, and I think both of these are really interesting because if the Russian economy was doing really well, if it was continuing as if nothing had happened, then why would it need to start banning the export of some of its most valuable commodities? The Russian economy has been built on the export of oil. It's got huge reserves and it's one of the world's largest exporters. So the fact that it announced a 6-month ban earlier this year on the export of all gasoline products is really quite puzzling if you think that the Russian economy is still doing really well, particularly when you take into account the fact that Russia has over 40 mega refineries. These are huge facilities, and their sole purpose is to take in crude oil from Russia and convert it into higher value products such as gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and then sell those higher value products all around the world. And the fact that Russia announced a 6-month ban and then recently announced that it was extending that ban for a further 2 months into September and October really does raise the question as to what's going on in the Russian oil industry. Because initially, when they said that that ban was coming in, they said that firstly, it was due to maintenance. They wanted to do some routine maintenance on their refineries. And secondly, it was to ensure that all of the farmers had enough fuel to be able to go through the harvesting process. Now, the harvesting process doesn't last for 8 months. So that doesn't really cover the fact that they banned all these exports. And the maintenance process is something that's done every year. It isn't something that lasts for 8 months. It should be done in a matter of weeks. So neither of those explanations really give us a good valid reason as to why Russia banned the export of gasoline. And what it tells us is that there are underlying problems in the industry right now. And as I've reported a number of times, Ukraine has now changed its focus in terms of its retaliation against Russia, and it's now targeting some of those refineries that are based in Russia with drones. And those drones have hit a number of different facilities, around 14 at the present count, and those facilities have had to close down, some of them just for a matter of days, others have been closed for weeks and months, because if you hit one part of the process, it can close down the entire facility. So Russia is definitely experiencing major problems right now with its oil industry, and these export bans really show us that it doesn't have enough gasoline at the moment to be able to export worldwide. On the 3rd of May 2024, TASS, the official Russian news agency, reported that the Russian government had announced on its Telegram channel that Russia had introduced a ban on the export of cane or beet sugar and chemically pure sucrose, and that those restrictions would remain in force until the 31st of August 2024, with the decision being aimed at maintaining stability of the domestic food market. So what this ban on sugar exports tells us is that the problems in Russia are not contained to just the oil and gas industry. The sanctions are having far-reaching implications. They're affecting lots of different sectors. And because Russia is struggling to be able to import the same level of goods that it did historically, it's now having to change the way it operates. And previously it was exporting sugar. It had more than enough for its own markets that it was able to sell them globally. However, because it now needs to divert that sugar into other industries to compensate for the lack of imports, that means it's no longer exporting and it's no longer being paid for those exports. So this again will impact on the Russian economy by reducing the level of revenue that Russia is earning. One of the other issues raised in the article is what's happening with inflation in Russia. This chart shows the movement in the official rate of inflation in Russia over the past 12 months. And what you can see here is that in June 2023, the official rate of inflation was 3.3%, which was exactly where the Russian central bank wanted it to be, because the target rate of inflation in Russia is 4%. Now in July 23, inflation rose above that target rate to 4.3%. And as you can see, over the last 12 months, there has been a consistent and rapid increase in inflation. And the most recent level reported for June 2024 is 8.6%. So inflation is now more than double the target rate for Russia. And if we have a look at this chart, which shows the movement in producer prices in Russia, so also known as the factory gate prices, which give us a really good indication as to what's likely to happen to future inflation, it tells us that there are major problems in Russia right now. In June 2023, producer prices were actually flat. They didn't increase at all. There was a 0% movement. That increased to 4.1% in July. Over the next 4 months, it skyrocketed into double figures and hit a peak of 21.9% in November. And it's remained in double figures since that time. And the most recent figures for June 2024 show that producer prices are up by 14%. And what that means is that those factory gate prices are increasing at a rate far outstripping the current rate of inflation in Russia. And as those products hit the shelves in Russia, it's likely that prices will continue rising, and that's going to drive up inflation even more. And this chart shows the movement in the official rate of interest in Russia over the past 3 years. And what this shows is that 12 months ago in July 23, the official rate of interest in Russia was 7.5%. However, over the past 12 months, it's been increased on numerous occasions and is now sitting at 18%. And if we look at how that compares to the rest of the economies in the G20, you can see that there are only 2 countries that have higher rates of interest at the moment, Turkey and Argentina, both of whom are in a state of economic crisis. And the only other countries with interest rates in double figures are Mexico and Brazil, and they're at 11 and 10.5%, so considerably less than 18%. And of course, one of the major problems that Russia has is that it's increasing its interest rates to try to bring inflation back under control, but that isn't working. And as we've just discussed, producer prices are continuing to rise above the level of inflation, so it's likely that we could see interest rates in Russia going above 20% at some point in the near future. One of the other issues raised in the article is the fact that Russia is now re-Sovietizing its economy. So basically moving to this wartime economy effort whereby the Kremlin is sponsoring a lot of companies to continue helping with the war effort. So basically those companies are producing things that are needed in the war. They're being paid directly by the Kremlin, and this is now becoming a very insulated market because those companies aren't interacting with the rest of the world. They're being paid by the state. And all of that will lead to a draining of Russia's reserves. And I'm currently working on a video to talk about exactly what's happening with the National Wealth Fund, so look out for that coming out at some point soon. And this obviously isn't healthy in terms of the Russian economy, because what we've got at the moment is a shortage of workers, rising wages and lower productivity in terms of its actual output for global exports. As a result of the invasion of Ukraine, around 1.2 million people have been lost from the workforce. 500,000 people fled the country immediately following the invasion, and another 700,000 departed when the mobilisation effort was called around August-September 2022. And in addition to that, it's been reported recently that Russia have lost around 450,000 men either killed or injured as a result of the fighting in Ukraine itself. So that takes us up to around 1.7 million people being taken out of the workforce. And what we are seeing now is that wages are rising rapidly because the companies that are being sponsored by the state need to hire more people. Therefore, they're having to offer higher wages to attract in more staff. People are leaving their existing jobs to go to those places to work. As a result of that, the companies that are losing staff are now having to offer higher wages to attract in even more people. And the problem that Russia has at the moment is that it hasn't got a lot of migration. Not many people want to move to Russia right now for economic purposes. If you move to Russia at the moment for a job, there is a possibility that you could be told that you need to go to Ukraine either to continue that job and do it in Ukraine itself, or you may even be told that you need to go and join up and get into the front line. So migrants who previously may have gone to Russia to earn money and send it back to their families in other countries are nervous at the moment. And there is a lot of reports that migrants who are already there are considering leaving the country. So there is a major problem in terms of the workforce at the moment. Russia has a declining population because of its low birth rate and high death rate. That's been accentuated by the war in Ukraine, and the fact that it's struggling to attract in migrant workers is making the situation worse. And the problem that Russia has is that the longer the war in Ukraine goes on and the more the Kremlin sponsors all of these companies, the worse it's going to get. And that's what's been highlighted in this article, that although GDP is going up, and it looks like Russia is doing really well compared to some of the other economies around the world, actually, when you dive into the details, the reason for that increase in GDP is not sustainable in the long term. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think this article that's been written by the 8 finance ministers in Europe is really interesting, because this is the hottest topic of debate. Whenever I make a video on this topic, it always raises lots of comments below from people saying, Russia is doing fantastically well. Stop lying about the situation. But in this article that's been written by the 8 finance ministers, who are highly qualified people, these are people who've studied economics, so they know how the world works, and they are representing their countries, so they've been appointed to be in charge of the budgets of their countries. So they're quite well qualified to be able to comment on what's going on all around the world. And for a lot of the countries that are involved on this list, they have a close relationship historically with Russia. Maybe not so much at the moment because of the sanctions and everything that's happened. But if you look at where they're located geographically, a lot of these countries either border Russia or are very close to bordering Russia. So they've got a long-standing relationship. And this article says that Russia is not telling the truth about what's happening in its economy right now. And there are a number of reasons that have been cited for that. Firstly, they're saying that this move towards becoming a wartime economy is detrimental to Russia in the long term, because effectively Russia is now paying itself. Rather than living off the income that it was earning from its exports of oil and gas and all of the other commodities that Russia has at its disposal, it's now paying its companies to produce things to keep the war effort going. And at some point, those reserves will run out because it's a finite amount of capital. Russia is obviously still exporting some oil and gas and other commodities to countries like China and India, but not as much as it was historically, and the value in terms of what it's actually selling those goods for has gone down because of the discounts that it's having to offer in the international markets. And the article itself has cited the fact that Russia has banned gasoline and sugar exports as fact that Russia is struggling right now in terms of what's going on with its productivity. And the other issue that's been raised in this article is what's happening with the workforce. Russia is struggling right now in terms of having enough people to fill all of its jobs. There are labour shortages, and those labour shortages are driving up wages. And partly as a result of that, inflation is now rising rapidly. And one of the other factors that's fueling inflation is the higher import costs as a result of the fact that the ruble has fallen in value. So there are a number of different factors that are all converging to put pressure on Russia. And that's really the point of what these ministers are trying to say. The sanctions have been designed to put financial pressure onto Russia to try to encourage it to bring some sort of peace settlement to Ukraine. That's essentially what all of the countries are trying to do. They're trying to stop the war in Ukraine by making it more and more difficult for Russia. And the essence of this article says that Russia, despite the fact that it claims that it's fine and everything is going really well, the actual reality of the situation is somewhat different. So the overall summary of today's video is that this article that's been posted basically is saying that Russia, through its reporting of what's happening in the economy, is not telling the truth, and that the fundamental problems that are starting to build in Russia will have a hugely detrimental impact on the Russian economy in the long term, but the West will continue to apply those sanctions until Russia comes to some form of peace settlement in Ukraine. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end. Don't forget, if you'd like to win this thing, have a look in the section below, and here's something to put a smile on your face.